Hello, good evening to everyone. Thank you for coming to our conference cycle called Homme, Territoire, Société. So tonight we are welcoming Professor Arlo Griffiths from the French School for Asian Studies. So just a brief introduction before we start. So he got his PhD in Sanskrit from Leiden University in 2004. And after several positions, he joined FAO, so the French School for Asian Studies, in 2008 as a professor of Southeast Asian history. He was then posted at Jakarta from 2009 to 2014, and he now teaches at l'École pratique des hautes études. Last but not least, starting from 2019 to 2025, he will serve as one of the three principal investigators of a major project funded in the European Research Council Synergy Scheme, so a project called Dharma for the domestication of Hindu asceticism and the religious making of South and Southeast Asia. So before we start, just let me thank our partners. So FAO, the French School for Asian Studies, who co-organized the event, and also the French National Research Institute for Sustainable Development, also known as ERD, for their technical assistance. So now, please give a warm welcome to Professor Arlo Griffiths.
Thank you, everyone, for being here this evening. Can I speak in Indonesian, or would there be some people who would prefer I speak in English?
What?
I can't see much, but hands for English. I see some hands for English. So then I think I will speak in English. I will try to speak slowly, and we will have a question-answer session afterwards where anybody can speak any language they want, including Indonesian. So the subject of my talk this evening is Javanese society in the 13th century, new research on the epigraphic corpus of the reign of Kertanegara. Now, I have never given a talk at IFI before. I've never given talks in Jakarta with so many people in the audience. Maybe it's useful to start just for a moment by looking at some of the words in this title, because over the years I've learned when speaking to young people, older people in Indonesia, that many people don't actually know who Kertanegara is. I don't know if there are any people in this room who don't know who Kertanegara is, and if there are, then I don't know if you dare to admit it. But let's just say that Kertanegara was a very important king in the second half, or maybe we can better say the fourth quarter of the 13th century. And the kingdom that he was king of was called either Tumapel or Singosari, or also just Yaladvipa, the island of Java. I should say that I started doing research on this quite a long time ago, maybe 8 years ago or so, inspired partly by these two articles that appeared, I think in 2010 and 2011, by the British scholar, a British scholar who goes by an Indonesian name, Hadi Sidomulyo. So one is from Kutaraja to Singosari, and the other one Kertanegara and the resurrection of Mpu Barada. So reading these articles, I got inspired, and also discussing with the author, I got inspired to study more about this period of Indonesian history. And so since then, I have been trying to collect information and have been trying to translate texts that we have from this period, and slowly trying to learn more. But I haven't been researching this very intensively at any moment, so I should also apologize that anything I have to say today, for some of you at least, won't be very new, and I also can't draw any very important conclusions yet at this stage, but I just want to share with you some of the work that I've been doing and some of the directions that perhaps could be interesting in coming years. So I just showed you sort of the most recent scholarship on Kertanegara, but now let me take you back to the beginning of research on Kertanegara. More than 100 years ago, the great Dutch scholar N.J. Krom published an article whose title means A Sumatran Inscription of King Kertanegara. Now this is interesting because King Kertanegara, as I just said, was a king of Java. So what's an inscription by King Kertanegara doing in Sumatra? Well, that is what this article is about. I'm not going to summarize it for you now, but I'll come back to that article in a minute. Before I focus on inscriptions, because that's the focus of my talk and also the focus of my research, let me just remind you of some of the important places that we can visit and things we can see in Java if we want to get a feeling of where Kertanegara was and what he did and what he used his money for, because he partly used his money to get nice chandis built. So here we see, of course, the famous Candi Singosari, presumably near where his capital was. Here's Candi Jawi. You see just the lereng of Gunung Penanggungan on the left. And here the famous gate guardians at Candi Singosari. If you have never seen them, they are about 4 meters tall, I mean much larger than I am. Candi Jago, and I just want to point out to you that in front of Candi Jago there's this sculpture of a Buddhist god who is called Amoga Pasha, and we will see a few other cases of works of art produced at the command of Kertanegara, which represent this particular deity, this particular god. I'm not going to go into an attempt of why this god, but I'm sure interesting things could be said about that. So now back to Krom's article, where he actually sketches a sort of general background of what he could know at his time, 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, about the history of Singosari. And the first category of sources that he refers to are Chinese documents, because actually this period of history, especially the end of the reign of Kertanegara, is an interesting phase of contact between China, which was at the time governed by Mongol kings, Kublai Khan, who sent his ships to Southeast Asia, and at a certain point also his soldiers landed on Java. So these documents, we have quite a lot of Chinese documents which give interesting details on dates and persons and places in Java at that time. Another very important source is the text which scholars nowadays call Deshavarnana, which everybody in Indonesia, I hope everybody knows, maybe under a different title, namely Nagara Kertagama. But actually already more than 100 years ago, an Indonesian scholar, Purbo Charoko, said that, well, look, if you just read the text, it says very clearly that it's called Deshavarnana. It's not called Nagara Kertagama, so let's call it Deshavarnana. But it took a very long time for scholars to sort of realize that they should use this title. And I think in Indonesia, let's say, history books have still not really caught up with that. So most Indonesians still think about Nagara Kertagama. So a very important text written in the old Javanese language, bahasa Jawa kuno, in poetry. So it's not a sort of prose text, but it's yeah, it's in poetry, so it has a particular kind of flavor. It's not like a history book with dry facts, but it actually tries to be beautiful while telling a story. And basically all of this is to praise King Hayam Wuruk. Then the third one, the Pararaton. Now that is a prose text, so it's more a dry chronicle, composed in the 15th century, so a bit later than the Deshavarnana. And then, of course, inscriptions in Old Javanese, in Sanskrit, and also in Old Malay. So Old Javanese, basically the ancient language of Java. Old Malay, more or less the ancient language of Sumatra and some other places. And Sanskrit, well, a language that was used on some special occasions in well, various places of ancient Indonesia. So at the time, Krom counted 26 inscriptions dating to the reign of Kertanegara. So he defined a period, I forget now precisely which period he defined, but let's say from the year 1250 to the year 1300, and in that period he knew 26 inscriptions, but only 5 of them containing useful information. Now, useful is my translation of his Dutch word, and this word useful, I think, is also interesting to discuss because it reflects very much a kind of history that people were used to write 100 years ago, and that people are maybe still used to writing to a certain degree. But what I would like to do, I don't have anything new to say really about kings and years and such things. So, but I think I can say new things about society and culture in this period. So I would like to do kind of a different kind of history. And so if we do a different kind of history, which is not only focused on, well, events and kings, then maybe some things which Krom didn't consider useful might be useful after all. Just about these Chinese sources, the Chinese documents containing about this naval expedition of Kublai Khan. Sorry, I have to get used to this. A few years ago, a nice book was published. Actually, a second edition was published of this book of palm. Well, the second edition is called "Of Palm Wine, Women and War: The Mongolian Naval Expedition to Java in the 13th Century." It was originally published in 2002, but then an improved edition was published quite recently in Singapore. And so if you want to know more about especially those Chinese sources, then you can look there. Now, I just want to give you a list of all of the inscriptions that I have counted so far. And actually, I'm not counting the so-called useless items here. Sorry, it's a little bit arbitrary, but so I could add a few more. But basically, here are the ones that have a date and that have a considerable amount of text. And basically, everything that's in yellow was already known to Krom, and everything that is not in yellow was not yet known to Krom or not acknowledged by him as belonging to the period that I'm talking about. And I'll come to speak later about how I think I can situate in this period of time, so the second half of the 13th century, documents which don't have a date, and maybe which don't even mention Kertanegara. I'll explain that in a moment. So in other words, we have, well, here I count 27, but it's a little bit difficult to count because, for instance, Amoga Pasha Plaque 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they all have exactly the same text. So it doesn't, I mean, in terms of historical documents, they count as one, I guess you could say. Oh yes, and a few other things I want to draw your attention to. So the kinds of inscriptions we're looking at, they are very often on copper plate, but sometimes on stone sculpture, copper plate, stone stela, copper plate, bronze sculpture, etc. Here I have something about Sanskrit. OJ is for Old Javanese, so the language is mostly Old Javanese, but we have Sanskrit in a few cases and Old Malay in one case. Of course, I could say, yeah, and we have some dates. This is Saka dates, so that means you have to add 78 to get our Masehi date. So the earliest one I'm counting is from 1188, so that's around 1256 AD. Okay, and now I give you a quotation from this article by Krom of 1916, which I've translated into English. So let me read that for you. For Javanese ancient history as a whole, the inscriptions, as authentic documents from the time itself, constitute the most reliable material and, for a large part of that history, the only material we have. However, they only give certain historical events as incidental circumstances. They are, after all, almost exclusively charters of foundations and donation, in which one finds the reigning king, the officials assisting him, a list of privileges and demarcations, and a call for the wrath of the gods against offenders, but in which rarely any historical fact is mentioned in a coherent manner as a reason for the issue of the charter. However, the inscriptions inform us better about social and administrative relationships than about certain events. This, in turn, has the advantage that, when casually mentioning such a fact, the aim is not to put it in a certain light, so that the relatively unintentional benefit, sorry, the translation here needs to be improved a little bit. Anyhow, what I just want to draw your attention to is how Krom, what he considers historical facts. So basically for him, historical facts are events related to the king. And then he says that inscriptions inform us better about social and administrative relationships than about certain events. So for him, actually, social and administrative relationships are not historical facts. I think nowadays historians mostly would agree that, let's say, if you do social history or economic history or such things, that definitely social and administrative relationships are also historical facts that we can research. So in other words, Krom himself already said that inscriptions could be very usefully studied for such questions, but he didn't consider that an interesting question himself. He was interested in events. Now, just an example of one of the so-called useless inscriptions that Krom mentioned. So this says Mangadag Ning Bodhi Isaka 1203, which means something like the erection, the establishing of the Bodhi happened in the Saka year 1203, so that means 1281 AD. So in the year 1281, a Bodhi, that is a bring-in tree, was planted. So, well, that's a... Well, I don't know what we should make of that, but let's say I just want you to illustrate for you that for people with the mindset of Krom, this is not a useful piece of information. Of course, if we're only interested in kingdoms and in events and in kings, then this is not so interesting. However, it might be that we're interested in the history of plants in Java, or the history of the worship of the bring-in tree, or let's say aspects of cultural history in which the bring-in tree, which is, I think all of you know, a very important tree in Indonesia. Of course, from that point of view, this might actually be a rather useful inscription. Of course, it's quite short, so we will never be able to write whole books about it, but at least it might be useful in some contexts. Now, among the inscriptions that I did include in my list, which I perhaps should have excluded because it's in a way rather untypical, is an inscription which bears the year 1191. So counting very quickly, that's I think 1291 AD. And this stands in the pendopo of the Kabupaten in Blitar, and it's quite clearly engraved on all four sides. it's been known for a very long time, already 120 or 130 years, but people haven't really been able to make sense of what it says, and neither have I. But what it's clear is that it's not a message of the king, so this is also another thing that should be dibongkar, as they say. So in popular perception, inscriptions are typically about kings and messages or decisions of kings. Well, this is quite often the case, but it's definitely not always the case. And so basically I think it's useful to distinguish between royal inscriptions, inscriptions which were engraved in stone or metal because the king asked someone to do so, and non-royal inscriptions which were left by some person, maybe a religious man or maybe a trader. And often we see rather typical differences. For instance, the shape of letters in these non-royal inscriptions is often quite different from the shapes of letters in royal inscriptions, and of course also the things they talk about can be quite different. So if you want to see lots of non-royal inscriptions, then you can go to Candi Suku or Candi Chita and get an impression of what they are like. And if you want to see lots of royal inscriptions, well, then you go to other places like Museum Nacional. Okay, so this one dates to that period, but as far as I can tell so far has nothing to do with King Kertanegara. Now let's look at things which do have something to do with Kertanegara. And this is one of 5 almost identical bronze plaques. They're quite small, maybe this tall. There's one in Berlin, there's one in Amsterdam, there's one in Leiden, there's one now in New York, I believe, and I don't remember where the 5th one is. I don't think, as far as I know, they've all left Indonesia a long time ago. But they're not identical. The text on the back has a different layout. It's the same text, almost basically identical text, but it doesn't have the same layout in every case. So that means in every individual case, an artisan has engraved the same text, but choosing a different layout. Let's say in one case line 1 ends after 10 letters, in another case it ends after 11 letters, etc. So that's the only difference. And we see here again this god, Amoga Pasha, whom we also saw in that sculpture in stone, as you may remember, at Candi Jago. And we'll come to see another example soon. So we have 5 of these. And what do they say? They use Sanskrit as language on the back, and if you are a lover of ancient Indonesian scripts, aksara kuno, then, and if you are able to use that picture on the right, it's not very clear, sorry, then you would have recognized that this is not the normal alphabet used in Indonesia at the time. This is not aksara Kawi or aksara Jawa kuno, or however you want to call them, but this is Nagari. So this is a different alphabet, which is basically only used when people write Sanskrit in Indonesia, and generally when the context is Buddhist. So what did he say? I will just skip the Sanskrit itself. It starts with a quotation of a very famous verse, which Buddhists all over the world, well, in any case from Afghanistan to Java to Bali to Vietnam to Japan to Mongolia and everything in between, a verse which Buddhists use when they want to recall the value of giving. The Tathagata has indeed, the Tathagata, that is the Buddha, has indeed declared the cause of those phenomena that arise from causes as well as their cessation. Such is the teaching of the great ascetic. This is a summary of the teaching of Buddhism, that phenomena have causes and that phenomena can also be stopped. And if you want to reach the stopping, the cessation of phenomena, that means you reach nirvana. So that's just a very brief summary of what Buddhism is about, and then we get a message, and this is also very typical. We could find hundreds, probably thousands of inscriptions throughout Asia which say basically the same thing except that the name of the person changes. So what does it say? This is a pious offering of the great Mahayana follower. So Mahayana is a branch of Buddhism. The devout lay follower of the triple jewel that is Dharma, Sangha, and Buddha. So that is the law, the community of Buddhist monks, and the Buddha that is the founder of the religion. So this is a pious offering of the great Mahayana follower, devout lay follower of the triple jewel, the glorious king over kings, His Majesty King Kertanegara, Vikramagnana Vajratunga. What merit there is in this offering, may it help the totality of all beings, first among them my preceptor, my teacher, my tutor, mother and father, to attain the fruit of unsurpassed wisdom. What is the fruit of unsurpassed wisdom? Maybe this is not very clear for most of you, but if you study Buddhism a little bit, then it's clear that this means nirvana. So basically, these plaques were made by Kertanegara, and he gave them, presumably he put them in a temple, maybe Chandijago, so that people could worship them, and by worshipping them, people would gain amal baik, which would help them in their spiritual path, and by helping other people get amal baik, he himself gets extra, he gets a porsi ganda, and so that then he doesn't want to keep for himself, but he gives it to his teacher and his father and his mother to help them in their spiritual path. So this is also very typical of Buddhism, that there is a kind of circle of good deeds that people do, and then they try to basically give the credit not to themselves but to others, and help people on their path. So this is what these in Sanskrit inscriptions on these bronze plaques say, and well, it's quite interesting to know that this tradition of using such very typical Sanskrit expressions was known in Java at the time. It had been maybe many centuries earlier. We had found similar things in Java, but then after a gap of a few hundred years, suddenly this emerges again. So that's interesting. Well, and there are various other things for the religious and cultural history of Java that might be interesting here. And what's perhaps also interesting is that we learn one of the kind of Sanskrit names, Vikramagnana Vajratunga, of Kertanegara. Javanese kings often have such Sanskrit names, and they're often a little bit different from one case to another. And so we can put them next to each other and see what the differences are and try to understand something from that, but I'm not going to go into that. So I promised another one of these Amoga Pashas. This is a famous sculpture which was found in what is now, if I'm not mistaken, Sumatra Barat, or in any case at the boundary of Sumatra Barat and Jambi, on the Batanghari River, at two sites not far from each other. On one site, this square block was found, or sokol, I say in English, and at another site, this statue was found, and obviously they belong together, although they were found in different places. And the sokol has an inscription going around it, and the language here is Old Malay. So basically the ancestor language of Bahasa Indonesia, although one of the sad things is that nowadays in Indonesia, when you say Melayu or Malay, people don't think that is their own heritage. People think, that belongs to Malaysia. But that is, well, I would say, too bad, because actually Melayu and Malay is just the ancestor of Bahasa Indonesia. And so I always want to encourage my Indonesian friends to be proud of Malay also. Yes, so this inscription says that in basically this year, 1208 Shaka, so that's 1286 AD, that King Kertanegara sent to the king of Suvarnadvipa, I think that's Suvarnabhumi maybe, that he sent this sculpture, and it was diiring, I forget precisely what the words, but basically it was accompanied by various men who were bringing it there, and then at the end he gives the reason for why he did so, and part of it is again that he wanted to make religious or spiritual merit, that he wanted to collect amal by. Okay, and here's another Buddhist sculpture, this one in Surabaya, in the center of town, but it doesn't come from Surabaya. It was found near Trowulan in the 19th century and then brought to Surabaya. And this has an inscription going all around this sort of pillow on which the Buddha is sitting. And the language is again Sanskrit. And together with my colleague, Dr. Titi Sortinasiti, who has been kind enough to come this evening, in 2012 we were able to make these rubbings. Well, this inscription was quite well known, so these rubbings haven't changed history, but at least we can see the letters quite clearly here. So this is eight Sanskrit verses, which basically say a few things, but it's all about why this sculpture was made in the first place. And just to emphasize this, so here I've shown you two inscriptions in Sanskrit, with this one, and then the ones on the bronze plaques, that one, and then the Old Malay one. But just about the Sanskrit, it's quite unusual. Let's say by the time we have reached the 13th century, there have been more than 200 years, I think, between that and the previous time that any Javanese king expressed himself in Sanskrit. So normally kings were writing in Old Javanese. So we can also ask ourselves, so why suddenly, after a large gap, what does it mean that suddenly Sanskrit is used again? It's basically a foreign language, or a language that was not normally used. So I think for us as historians, that's also a challenge to try to come up with a interesting and, if possible, convincing hypothesis on why this king suddenly started using Sanskrit again. And another inscription on a sculpture, here the language is Old Javanese. This one you can find in the Pusat Informasi Majapahit in Trowulan. This was a sculpture of a very scary Hindu goddess, Hindu or Buddhist, Chamundi. And actually after it was found, it was so scary that the farmer who found it immediately broke it into hundreds of pieces, and then it had to be put together again. So that's why you see it's in a rather bad state. And this dates from 1214 Shaka, so there we are in the 1290s AD. Now, I mentioned earlier that this list of inscriptions that I had, that there were quite a number which Krom didn't use because he didn't consider them as dating to the period that I'm talking about. Now, why do I think that I can add quite a few items to that list? Basically, it is on the basis of writing styles. So this is something, well, that you should know when you're studying ancient documents from Indonesia, that basically every time, with every period and place, comes its own shape of letters, and then the letters evolve over time. But even in a given region and a given period, we can identify specific writing styles, which might actually be individual scribes, although it's hard to be entirely sure. But I myself would not be surprised if indeed there were one or two scribes from the second half of the 13th century who were in the service of the court, of the king, so who basically engraved things on stone and copper plate. And the fact that there was perhaps, so I would suppose that there was a very small number of such scribes, which means that we actually see the same writers in a number of documents. So then, of course, we can be sure that an inscription dates to this period if it has a date, and if it contains the name Kertanegara, but if we don't have such information from the inscription itself, then we might still be able to date the inscription to that period by using this script style. So I'm not sure that it's useful. Well, let me just read this for you a bit slowly, and if you have questions about it, then later. So this is translated from the French. It is interesting to note that the inscription of Dharmashraya, that was the one in Old Malay, of 1208 Shaka, the one of Wurare, that's the one from Surabaya, and this Chamundi, that's the one I just showed, are in varieties of ancient Javanese writing that not only belong to the same type, but are practically identical. Another inscription, that of Gajah Mada, by contrast, which is about 60 years younger, 1273 Shaka, is of a totally different type. And then there are some footnotes, and maybe I'll just read what is in bold in that footnote. We can now be very affirmative and say that we are dealing with exactly the same writing style, and I agree. When we look at these three inscriptions, it's exactly the same letters in stone. And, well, we're dealing, of course, with the pre-modern era. There weren't any computer fonts yet. So, well, I cannot tell you. I mean, I cannot tell you if we see three different objects in stone which have letters which really look exactly the same. Does that necessarily mean that it was the same person who was involved, or does it not? I cannot answer that question myself, but I would say, I would at least presume, probably it does mean that there was one person involved. The same person was involved. And that's what other scholars also assume. Okay, and then more about the same. So in other words, if we find now other stone inscriptions, or also copperplate inscriptions, which show exactly that same shape of letters, then that gives us a reason to add those other inscriptions to the big file of inscriptions of the Singosari period. So that's basically the method that I'm using. And using that method, well, this one contains a date, so this is not a new one, but this one shows in copperplate, again, exactly the same letters as what we see in those stone inscriptions. This is a particularly nice one. This is actually from the reign of Vishnuvardhana, so Kertanegara's father. And now I'm going to show you some passages from this and a few other inscriptions in translation. And you are probably going to say, well, look, this is very complicated. I don't understand much. And so basically that's my point. That for us as historians studying this kind of stuff, I always get the answer, so basically you translate. Well, yes, I translate, but before we translate, we first have to read these letters. So we first actually need to sort of decipher into what they call alih aksara, so we need to put it into Roman letters. We need to be very sure of what the text actually is, and only in the second step can we go to what the text actually means. And what the text actually means, we can do it in bahasa Indonesia, or we can do it in any other language, English in my case. And then you will see that these texts they're not easy texts, and they require a lot of background knowledge for us to understand them. And one of the big challenges is that we lack some of the background knowledge we can get by studying, let's say, it's the kinds of knowledge that we can get by studying other sources that still exist, but lots of the background knowledge, which was very specific to the time and place and to the people involved. They would know who Mr. X was, but we don't know who Mr. X was. And they would know where a village Mangadua was, but well, we know where a Mangadua is, but there might have been other Mangaduas in time. So it's challenging stuff. So in other words, if we want to then prepare this, use this kind of material to write something more general, or to ask questions about social history and cultural history, well, there are lots of steps we need to do first before we can reached the level of those questions. And I haven't reached the level where I can start to focus on those general questions, because I'm still working on just trying to understand what these texts say. Okay, so this is, and yeah, another important point is that this inscription from Pakistan, which is on the slope of, it says something about Magalang there, but I think that's wrong. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that this comes from Penelitian, which is on Gunung Wilis, but don't quote me on that. Yes, so this is, and this is very typical, the first plate of a set. So, at the time, kings, if we're talking about royal inscriptions, they were either on big stones or on copper plates, and then some very rare other things like those copper plaques, bronze plaques. But most of the material we have is on big stones or on copper plates. And the copper plates were always multiple sets. You should consider them like a book. So there was a pile of pages of copper plates, and so these things are normally about this big, this high, and they can be 2 or 3 or 4 millimeters thick. And the problem is that they were not bound together, and so very often we don't have the complete set. We have only one, and the pages are often numbered, not in this case, but often there are plate numbers on the left or the right, and so then we can actually see, well, this is plate number 6, but where is plate 5 and where is plate 7? So this is another challenge in studying this material, that the documents that we have are in most cases not complete documents. We have only a small number of complete documents. So that means that yeah, we just have a middle page or the beginning page or the final page, and the rest we have to guess. So in this case it's just the beginning of the inscription. And what does it say? Om, homage to Shiva, hail! In the elapsed Shaka year 1188, month of Maga, 13th Tithi of the waxing fortnight, last Vagay, Tuesday, Buku Mahatal, Grahachara in the south, lunar mansion Pusha, deity Jiva Mandala in the southeast, conjunction Shogana, Muhurta Varuna, regent of the astronomical node Agni, Karana Tetila, zodiac sign Aquarius. So you see that there's a lot of astrology involved here, even though you probably don't know many of the words. You recognize at least the word zodiac sign, and maybe you recognize Vage and such things. So that's the date, and I've put it in blue here. All the inscriptions that we have, for which we have a beginning, I should say all royal inscriptions, because it's again typical for royal inscriptions that we have, and which we have in the beginning, begin with such a part that I've printed here in blue. And then they move on. That was the time that the instruction of the king, the conqueror of the world, insurmountable due to his heroism, which is inavertible by the indisputable courage of a lauded world ruler, so that's the king, whose royal consecration name is Raja Kertanegara, under the auspices of an instruction of the refuge of all kings, whose lotus feet were descended upon by the crest jewels of all noblemen. So the stuff I've put here in light blue are actually Sanskrit words which are inserted into the Old Javanese, and which are what I would call epithets. I don't know whether the word epithet, julukan or something like that. So this is also quite typical of this period. It exists a bit earlier, but it really starts to be quite common from this period onwards, that when we are at the beginning of a text, and especially the king and the members of the royal family and the high ministers, etc., that there would be some extra julukan like that in Sanskrit. And sometimes then we get them translated into Old Javanese in the same inscription. That doesn't happen here. But I just want to point out that this is a phenomenon which really starts to happen here, and this, I think, is a cultural practice which we can compare with other parts of the Hindu and Buddhist world, and I'm going to give you a comparison in a moment. And these are very typical things that you say about a king in the basically Indian worldview. Kings always conquer the whole world. Yeah? There aren't any kings who, and that's it, kings who don't do that, we don't even need to talk about them. So in other words, we should also realize that these texts are full of ideology, full of, what do you call it? Penerangan. What's the word I'm looking for? No, not. I meant penerangan in the Orde Baru sense. Propaganda. So, yeah, that is what a large part of these texts is propaganda. So, propaganda, that doesn't mean, I mean, we can study propaganda. We can study Orde Baru and study how the government at the time tried to control or persuade the Indonesian population in certain directions. And this itself is a historical process that we can study. We can study it for the 20th century, we can also study it for the 13th century. But at least we should be aware that it's propaganda. It's not, when the inscription says that he was a conqueror of the world, it doesn't mean that he went up to Alaska and etc. Okay, so we have Sri Kertanegara, and then there's somehow a relationship with Jaya Sri Vishnuvardhana, his father. And this is one of the things that is one of the problems where we don't really understand what's going on. But it seems that Kertanegara was already reigning before his father had died. So, yes, it's a complicated text, as I said. That was the time that the instruction of the king, whose royal consecration name is Sri Kertanegara, under the auspices of an instruction, so maybe in Indonesian we could say, di bawah naungan perintah Vishnuvardhana or something like that. But this is also just my English translation, and I'm not sure it's correct. So then, of the instruction of the Lord, whose deity consecration name was there. So that instruction was received. So we see here also the hierarchical order of government. So basically, Jokowi, he gives, what is it called, perpu or something like that. And then it goes down to the Menteri Koordinator, and then it goes down from the Menteri Koordinator to the Menteri Biasa, and then it goes down to the Directorat, etc. So the order was received by His Excellency the Great Minister of Hino, His Excellency the Great Minister of Sirikan, His Excellency the Great Minister of Halu. It came down to all the high officers, Kandara Krian, of the council. His Excellency the Councillor, His Excellency of Demung, His Excellency of Kanuruhan, the Secretary knowledgeable in politics and expert in covert matters, bearing the title Ramapati. Not left behind were the efficient of Tiruan, the efficient of Kandamui, the efficient of Manhuri, at the descending of the instruction of His Majesty the King, which was under the auspices of instruction of Lord Sri Jayavardhana, and the rest of the text is law. So basically, we don't learn what this inscription is about, because we just had all of the parts of the Silaturahmi before the actual business starts. But at least we know that something happened in 1188, and that two kings were involved. But this is a very typical beginning of an inscription. And this is again, as I said, it shows you before you actually, if you have a text which is complete, then you have to get through all of this stuff before you actually get to the heart of the matter. So now I want to step out of Java very far. I'm sorry that this is very ugly, but it's the best thing I have. Imagine that. This is actually a stone inscription, and I imagine that it has a shape very much like the stone inscriptions of Java that you can find many examples in Museo Nacional, or if you go to East Java, you can find them places there. This is not from Java, this is from Vietnam. And more specifically, part of Vietnam which used to be a kingdom called Champa, where people spoke a language which is called Cham, which is very closely related to Malay. So for example, when they say fish, they say ikan, and when they say... I'll give you an example in a moment. But there are some things which are really just exactly the same as in Indonesia. So this inscription, why do I mention it? Because it seems to date from a year which is Koshabila Eka. Shit, and I should have, of course, reminded myself. This is a so-called Chandra Sankala. I don't know if... Are there... Raise your fingers if you've never heard the word Chandra Sankala. Everybody knows... Ah, no. At least some people don't know what a Chandra... I think probably quite a lot of you, but you don't dare to admit it. Chandrasekhara is called in English a chronogram, and it's a way of expressing a number in words. And it's very typically used originally in Sanskrit, in verse context, but then what is typical about Java and about Champa is that they also use it in the local language, so that they insert these Sanskrit words, or sometimes even local language words, inside local language to express numbers, and it's basically always dates. And so let me see if I can get this. Rupa means 1, Eka means 1, Vila means 9, Kosha means 6, I think. So, and you always have to read them from the back, so this is 1, 1, 9, 6. So if you may remember, we just had 1188, so we're basically in the same period as the inscription I just looked at. And what does this say? Well, I didn't really have the time to try to propose a translation, and even if I had tried, I didn't try also because I thought it was difficult. But it says, Mada is the same as Ada in bahasa Indonesia. So there was a Raja Putri, well, I think you all, a princess, Pupong Tanah Raya. So Tanah Raya is Tanah Raya in bahasa Indonesia, and Pu is, well, related, and Pong, that's related to Pu, Mpu, and words like that, which indicate some kind of respected person. So there was a princess of the king, Pupong Tanah Raya, of Java, the Javadipa, the king of Java, Ya Marai. Marai is the same as Mari, but it has a slightly different meaning. It means something like datang, who came, di, but here it doesn't mean di, but dari, from Javadipa. Ya Derung, Derung is to bear. She bore the name, Sidah is something like Yaitu, Yalah, or something like that. Pupong Vya, Vya means queen. So, Her Majesty the Queen Tapasi, and here I'm not really sure. So this Yavadipa is here, and Yavadvipa is there, and Tapasi is there. So she had the name Queen Tapasi, and maybe she is the Hari Janani, the mother of Hari, but I'm not sure whether how the words shall be broken. And so, and then Puching is Prince Shri Hari Jitatma, blah 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 blah. Well, I don't really want to go into the rest, but basically there was a princess of Java who had some connection with Champa, and it all happened around the end of the 13th century. And actually already more than a century ago, Krom talked about this, and he said, well, it could be the daughter of Vishnuvardhana, or it could be the daughter of Kertanegara, but that doesn't really matter for me. I just want to point out that there were connections here, and we also know this from other reasons, because at the same time that the Chinese, Kublai Khan, was invading Java, actually he was also making war with Champa, and Champa and Java were sekutu, or allies, at that time. So I don't really care so much about all these sort of political things, but I just want to show you that there were contacts, and I want to propose that maybe these contacts explain certain similarities that are quite typical, at least, and of interest to me, maybe not so interesting for most people, but the fact, let's say, how people write texts, what is the interaction between the different languages, so the local language, Cham or Javanese, and Sanskrit, and the very idea of using such a chronogram in the local language, which might seem natural, but at least in other parts of Asia people didn't do it, whereas they did use chronograms when they were writing Sanskrit. So the fact that in Java and in Champa people did make that choice is, for me, an interesting coincidence, and it might mean something. Okay, that was a little step outside of Java, and now I come to one of the rare complete sets that we have. This is the so-called Sarvadharma Charter, complete in 7 plaques, kept since the 1970s or so in the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam, when for the project that we have had since 20 years now with Pusat Arkeologi Nasional to document basically all Indonesian inscriptions. 10 years ago I went to most of the Dutch museums and tried to make lists of all the inscriptions they had there, and to my great surprise this one was there. I wasn't expecting it, but it was there. It had been considered lost for a very long time. So it's kept there, and so I've tried to translate it, but I'm not going to show you that. I want to show you some boxes. Why do I want to show you some boxes? This one and this one is nicer. This one is kept in Museum Untitled. This one is kept in Leiden. This one, there's a drawing, it has some text on it and a date, namely 1263 Shaka, so that's a bit later than what we're talking about now. Why do I show this? Because actually it's in this kind of box that copperplate inscriptions were kept, presumably. And these boxes are an interesting Indonesian cultural feature, because the idea of writing on copper plates is not an originally Indonesian idea. This was already done in India much earlier. But when the Indonesians adopted this idea, and when they started making lots of plates, the idea of putting them in boxes is a specifically Indonesian invention. In India, they would use to drill a hole in the plate and put a big ring in it, so which has the advantage that often in India the sets of copper plates are still together, whereas, as I told you earlier, in Indonesia we often find just a few of them. So that's why it's so rare that we have this complete set, because in most cases these boxes, well, they would have been put somewhere and people just could remove a plate if they wanted to, or also, unfortunately, when nowadays these kinds of objects come on the antiquities market, the traders, they like to play a game. They just separate it, offer some plates to one person, offer some more to another to get more money. And that's how we lose the coherence between these plates. Yeah, that's how these copper plates were kept. And now to some new inscriptions. A few years ago I was contacted by Professor Peter Worsley, who works in Sydney, who had been a student of a Dutch scholar, Van Naarsen, who, after starting his career in Indonesia, and then the Netherlands, and then went to Australia. And in his inheritance, his widow had a few copperplate inscriptions, and one of them was already known. It's the Himad Walandit inscription, if that means anything to you. But this one was not known. And since then he has given them to the University Library in Leiden, where they can find now. And so these are two plates, I forget, number 2 and 3 or so. We don't have number 1 and we don't have the rest, but at least these two belong together, or they are in continuity the one of the other. And I will give you almost a complete translation, again to emphasize the challenges of such a text. So in this case we don't have the date, so I don't have to bore you with that again, but now we have a long part about boundary demarcations, pembatasan tanah. So this is also a typical feature of these inscriptions, and it's quite often a bit difficult to translate. So what does it say? We fall in the middle of a sentence, something with the Kerajaan. Then something turns eastward, heading for Bugel. Turns southwestward at Bugel, adjoining the boundary with Bugel. Turns southeastward at Bugel, adjoining the boundary with Bugel. Sharply turns northeastward, adjoining the boundary with Padang, cutting through the river. The 9 lands, I think this is Lemah Songo in the inscription, cut through the river northeastward. Eastward, they cut the river at Pagajutan, southward adjoining the military camp, turn southward adjoining the boundary with Lipung, eastward at the Gungung River, adjoining the boundary with Limbean, turn southward adjoining Lipung. So, these are the boundaries, and I haven't had the time, and I also don't really have the maps or the resources to try, but in many cases actually you find that the place names we find in these inscriptions are still found in the same form or slightly differently on the map today. So that's another piece of research that needs to be done at some point. And then from the blue to the black we come into a different paragraph. And it goes on. Moreover, the Holy Foundation has possessions to be taken by lance, not sure if that translation is correct, from thieves. Moreover, the Holy Foundation of the Sima at the Nine has dependencies, the fields at Humbug, Patahil, Puri, Amungur. Moreover, the Sima at the Nine, as grant of the Prince of Jangala, and this is interesting because here it means we don't have the king, but a prince giving some anugrah, a land grant, as grant of the Prince of Jangala, has been given the privilege of not being under authority of the servants of the king. None of all the former ones may meddle with it. Vulus and minor vulus, such as Mishras and Param, and minor Mishras, the Panguran, the Pakudur, the Varihati, the Aniga, the Pamanikan, the Manimpiki, the Malandang, the Lacha, the Limus Galuh, the Ramanang, the Winningle, the Katangaran, the Sukun, the Halu, Varak, the Ratchamung, the overseer of harlots, the overseer of gambling, the overseer of Hunjaman. So this is also very typical. The inscriptions have such a long list of words. Only some of them are partly clear in meaning, and some of them not at all. So this is also, it goes on, the overseer of cockfights, the overseer of cock cages, the blub, the kutak, the kukap, the sinagiha, the tankil, the salut, the avir, the aveu, the tupung kawung, the sung panghurang, the sikapan, the tiruan, the manghuri, the tanghiran, the ludan, the tutan, the alangan, the horse groom, the mahut, elephant, tukang gajah, the pawang. Okay, I didn't know that word, thank you. Do you say just pawang or pawang gajah? The quail herd, the padavut pangpang, the pakikis, the pavalit, the donan, the vuran, all requisites of all the royal servants, they do not enter the holy sima at the line. So, to cut short, this just means that when such a sima, basically a protected territory, has been given to some party, all kinds of people who previously had the right to come there and ask for money, raise tax, or do other things that we might find unpleasant, they no longer had the right to come there. And those are those people listed. And so most inscriptions, most royal inscriptions, have such a long list. And it goes on. And the courtiers, the dwarves, the cripples, the albinos, the lilliputs, the pujut, the kamir, the bundan, they do not enter the holy sima at the night. So this is basically another group of people excluded from that territory from the moment of this inscription onwards. And now we get hakistimewa, privileges. Moreover, shall be given as privilege to all brethren in the nine. I think this is something like samasanak I soma. The raising of children, being allowed to brandish a white parasol, to play the churing accompanied by kangsi, to have bells tinkle by day and by night, to have ivory bamboo as bench, to use gold borre, to make offerings of the type vatang, sidayuga, angi, bunter, santi, kukuwaka, to wear as dress naga pushpa cloth, navagraha, ivory bench, tuuhvatu, hurup anak, hurip anak, ipeng flower, tutunjung, stemavaring. These are all probably names of batik patterns. Some of them apparently still known. All kinds of dress. And they were also to be allowed to play gunding in childish manner, to lead pigs, to fasten a loincloth with a cord, to lean on a bow, to shoulder a trough while wearing banantan. Banantan is another kind of cloth. To have the children's hair cut above a pavilion. Throughout the raising of children, they have no attachment. So this is also, parts of this we sort of understand, part of it are very obscure. But we see here, for instance, I think a very important thing of cultural history, and this is of course not me who has observed it for the time, but the importance of cloth. I mean, anybody, any bule who comes to Indonesia for the first time will learn very fast that everybody wears batik, and that some people like to talk about it a lot, and that some people have very specific ideas about what you should wear on which days and on which occasions, etc. And again, you learn quickly that batik is culturally very important. At least it used to be. Of course, now it's changing. And this is not something recent. This goes back more than 1,000 years. And we see it in the inscriptions. We see names of cloth patterns. We see, not here, but we see in other contexts that kings give gifts to people, money, but also cloth. And then different types of cloth, different patterns are mentioned. So, I go on. The end of the inscription. Thus was the wish granting of the Prince of Janga to all brethren in the Nine, an independent aduk ringgit sima. Aduk ringgit is a funny word, but it seems to mean the same thing as swatantra in other inscriptions. Swatantra means independent, tax exempt, tidak kena pajak. So in other words, the Prince of Jangala, he gave to this group of people who are called the brethren, and I'm sorry, I forget which old Javanese word I'm translating, but some group of kerabat at a place called the Nine, Yang Sembilan. It's rather, well, I don't know what that place is. So they got a sima. Moreover, all commoners serving as witnesses, together with the summoned javu. I don't know what javu is. So then we get a list of witnesses to the transaction and to the boundaries that we started with. At Kebang Awu, the overseer of commoners, Gagakapungari, was given confirmatory gifts. 1 masha, that's a quantity of gold, 1 sheet of cloth. At Lamongan, the overseer. Now this is interesting because this is perhaps the oldest mention of the Nama Kabupaten Lamongan in any source. So we have little bits of knowledge like that. Let me quickly go on and give, I think, my last, well, in the museum, the Anthropological Museum in Frankfurt, there are a few copper plates from Java. These are 2 different, they look very similar, but they belong to 2 different inscriptions. One called Air Asi and the other Parablian. And I have a long quote from that, but I think, I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I think maybe some people are losing attention a little bit. So let me try to go a bit faster and then finish. So what is very remarkable about these 2 inscriptions is that the person receiving a gift is described in terms like this. An order in favor of the efficient at Parablian, the Reverend Madhava, who was a Mahabrahmana, expert in the Yajurveda of the Madhyamnina school. Now, if you would go to India in the 13th century, in almost any inscription, you would find that the beneficiary, that person receiving land, was called a Brahmana, a Brahmin, and belonged to a certain Veda. As some of you may know, there are 4 Vedas in Hinduism, Rik, Yajur, Sama, and Atharva Veda, and every Veda has schools. Now, this is complicated stuff and you don't need to know, but what you do need to know, perhaps, what you might like to know, is that, as far as I know, we never, in other Indonesian inscriptions, anywhere, any period, any place, find mention of such schools of any Veda. So, that's quite unusual. And so again, we might ask, why is this happening in this period? And can we perhaps connect it with the other things that are particular about this period? For instance, the fact that Sanskrit is used. Well, these are the kinds of questions that I ask myself. And I just want to also, so here, this is quite a typical phrase also, and it's not at all exclusive to this period. From earlier centuries also, you would find that whenever a king makes a donation, we would find a sentence like this: why does the king make a donation? It is all because it caused to be firmer the position of His Majesty on the jewel and gem-studded lion throne, something like Ratna Kanaka Singhasana, in that he was served by all of the island of Java, Sa-Javadvipa, in immediate conjunction with the outer island. Outer island here I think is Nusantara, or probably Nusantara, Madura. So, at least in the worldview, the way that these kings themselves defined their territory, Java and Madura, that was sort of the core. I will skip all the rest. And now go to, I think, the last example. This is a set of copper plates kept by a collector in Hong Kong. Unfortunately, he told me that when some dealer in Indonesia offered to sell these things, actually, I think first he got photos of more than the ones that he could buy. But then when he asked to buy all of the ones that are in the photos, then this had already been sold to some other person, and I don't know who that other person is. So unfortunately, I know that there were more sets of this plate, but I cannot study all of them, so that's quite frustrating. And this is quite an interesting inscription, and it's quite long, and I will just focus on one part, which is relevant for economic history. In a rather small number of Old Javanese inscriptions, we find reference to the system of pawning, penggadaian. And this is, for me, quite complicated stuff to understand who is giving what to whom and giving what back. Well, this inscription has a long passage on that, and so don't quote this, because this is just terjemahan sementara, and I need to think about it a lot more and compare to other things, but it says something like this. And the descent of the favor of His Majesty to the merchant guild. So this is also interesting. Here the group of people who get the anugerah is a guild. Now, how do you say guild in Bahasa Indonesia? A kelompok pedagang? Something like that. To the merchant guild of Patitihan. That descent happened when the merchant guild of Patitihan had all kinds of pawns. Sedang memiliki banyak gadai, something like that. Whether for 3 years, for 3 months, for 3 nights, prior to it being forfeited, if the pawner did not care at all to comply with the delay of payment. But the merchant guild at Patitihan would first inform the pawner if the pawner would be unwilling to redeem, and it would not give a delay of payment on it if it were forfeited, and it would be made known to many people. Moreover, if there is a pawn that is lost, if it is gold, it will be sprinkled over so that it is similar in appearance. I'm not sure what this means. If it is karawang, I don't know what that means. It will be silvered so that it is similar in appearance. I get the impression that somehow they're making some kind of fake replacement for the object that was the gadaikan. If it is a jewel, it is to be replaced equal to its price when taken as pawn. And if there's any kind of possession that results from borrowing, it may be pawned by the lenders. They may even be sold, because the duration of the property does not revert to the lender as long as 2 years. If the lender should die, and certainly if he should be killed by the borrower, that property should not be confiscated so that the whole principal can be redeemed by the borrower. And if the lender lives, it should be seized by the borrower, and what is found of the property should be handed over to the Patitihan. The property should be confiscated, for the one like that is not a thief. Property left behind and property given in trust are like that. All types of temporary property will be of its kind. So, I don't know about your brain, but my brain is not very good at handling this kind of information. So, let us not, at least, I hope you're not going to ask me difficult questions about it, because I won't be able to answer. But at least, I think you can see that various, I don't know if anybody of you deals in economic history, but, or at least understands that this might be an interesting field of study. well, you see various kinds of transactions involving money described here, and rules. Rules that were presumably laid down by the king as part of the condition of the gift, recorded in this inscription. So this merchant guild, these kelompok pedagang, had the right to engage in pawning, but under certain rules. So let me now draw some very, very global conclusions. First, I think this is important, and this is the work that we have been doing and hope to continue to do over coming years with Ibu Titi, studying collections, public and private, inside and outside Indonesia, can yield quite a lot of untapped documentary material that people like us would like to decipher and translate and hopefully make public soon. Gamez's observation on script styles can be used to identify incomplete sets of copper plates as belonging to the Singosari period. And the one this one is one. There is no date. However, it begins with the plate number 2, and as you will remember, the Pakis Wetan inscription that I started with, which just had the date and this long list of king and officials. Well, if you just imagine an inscription which is a bit less tall, so less lines fit onto it, and if you also remember that the first plate, people always start writing on the back, so basically if you jump fairly soon to plate 2, that means you still get a part of the opening paragraph. So that's the case with this inscription. It starts with plate 2. So actually in this case, because there aren't as many lines, there are just 7 lines per plate. Oh, and by the way, you can also see here the plate numbers. It's not very clear on the photo. Yeah, so actually from this, in this, even though the beginning with the date is not there, but it's the middle of the sentence with Jaya Vishnu Vardhana is there. So I'm absolutely sure that this one is from that period. And even if I didn't have that, then I would be sure on the basis of the shape of the letters, which is the same as in some inscriptions which do have a date. Okay, so we can use Gamez's observation to basically define the inscriptions which belong to that period, and if, as is my case, we want to write something about that period, then that sort of delimits the material that we study. Kertanegara emerges as a king with personal devotion as a Buddhist. So this is also very important when studying the past. We should not think in terms of religions as always fighting each other. Hindus killing or Muslims and Buddhists killing Hindus. This is a picture of religions that we have in the modern world, and that Western scholars also had very much, because of course in the West there were Protestants and Catholics who were always banging each other's heads, and well, unfortunately nowadays we see lots of other people banging each other's heads in the name of religion. So it's really very important to forget about all of that and to imagine a world where, well, of course people were also banging each other's heads, but not necessarily in the name of this or that religion. So the fact that this king made personal gifts to Buddhism is one fact. That doesn't mean that he couldn't give money also to these Brahmins, one of whom I mentioned, or other groups of people. That doesn't matter. He could do anything he wanted, and so we just have to distinguish personal devotion and other forms of religion. So, as I also mentioned, this mention of Brahmins, said to be a specialist of a Vedic school, is very particular for this particular period of time, and it might mean that the king actually asked Brahmins from India to come. Although that's not, it could also mean something else. We have evidence of land grants by subordinate kings, so not only the top king was able to give land, but also often it was, let's say, it's sort of like maybe Harta, and so basically Keluarga Cendana, so they all get a little or a big slice of the pie. so it also worked like that. And so his brothers and sisters and brothers-in-law, sister-in-laws, they all got some kind of place to be king of, and one of them was Jangala. That was, of course, a very important one, which, as many of you may know. Evidence of the legal framework for financial transactions. The last example that I gave you. And then, although this is just the political connection with Champa possibly explains shared features of Cham and Javanese epigraphic culture. So this is a word I don't have the time now to explain, but epigraphic culture. Very simply, the things people do and do not do when writing text on stone and metal, etc. I mean, nowadays we can study internet culture or book culture or whatever. Imagine just epigraphic culture being another one, a field like that. And so we can compare different epigraphic cultures. And if we compare the ones in Southeast Asia, for instance, we will notice that Cham and Javanese epigraphy share some points, notably the use of Sanskrit chronogram words inside vernacular text and eulogistic Sanskrit epithets inserted into the vernacular text. Remember those long words in light blue that I showed you on one of the slides. So I'm wondering whether, let's say, the contacts between these two kingdoms led to a certain commonality of culture, which would be, of course, only to be expected. And that's everything I had to say this evening. Thank you very much.